From the Missouri School of Journalism, welcome to Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. When you think about the causes of climate change, most people think about burning fossil fuels to generate electricity or to power our cars. But one of the most important drivers of climate change is the clearing of tropical forests. Now, as forests are cut, the amount of carbon dioxide they can remove from the atmosphere is reduced, and the rate of deforestation is so great in the tropics now that it contributes more to climate change than the total annual carbon dioxide output of the United States. Now, this problem is particularly acute in Indonesia. In that country, a forest area the size of Delaware has been disappearing every year. One of the main reasons is the growth of Indonesia's palm oil industry. Now, palm oil is the Southeast Asian nation's largest export, and it's often produced on plantations built on cleared forest land. Accelerating climate change isn't the only consequence of this. There's also the destruction of habitat for endangered plants and animals, including species like the orangutan and the Sumatran elephant. On this edition of Global Journalist, a look at deforestation in Indonesia and its consequences for people and the environment. Now, in a few minutes, we'll bring in a panel of guests to talk about these issues, but first we're joined by Anja Korstens of the University of Bournemouth in the United Kingdom. She's an ecologist who studies the effects of deforestation on orangutans and other endangered animals in Indonesia. She's also the director of the Landscape Ecology and Primatology Project, or LEAP. Amanda, welcome.
Hi.
Well, first of all, if you could give us just a sense of what is sort of special about these forests in Indonesia.
I've been around the world. I've been in many different types of forests. And what I really like about the Indonesian forests is that you walk in, it's extremely noisy because there's always cicadas calling. And the trees are very, very high. So in the really nice primary forest, the trees will be up to 40, 50 meters tall. They can, some areas, get even taller. And when you walk through the forest, you will hardly ever see the sky because there's just a very good closed canopy in the areas that are undisturbed.
And you first went to these forests in Sumatra, one of the main islands in Indonesia, I guess about a quarter century ago, you told one of our producers. What has changed over that time?
Well, a lot has changed. So in the past, if you did the trip from the main capital of Sumatra, Medan, to the forest that I was working in the Leuser National Park, you would see forest all around you. The whole trip, there would be forests everywhere. Now, when you drive through these areas, you see plantations, especially palm oil plantations. There's a lot more landslides because of the clearing of forests on hilltops, on slopes. And basically, a lot of the forest in the lower lands that are not on mountain slopes are basically disappearing. There's hardly any of those forests left. And a lot of that falls even outside of the national park as well.
And one of the animals that you study, of course, are orangutans, one of the closest living relatives to humans. They live only in Southeast Asia. How is deforestation affecting them? What happens to them after their habitat is cleared?
Orangutans are notorious for not leaving the area where they were. So if you take away the forest, quite often the orangutans will stay there on this empty patch of land. And they tend to get badly handled by the people. People don't really like having them there. And so often these animals have to be removed, have to be taken to sanctuaries. If you also just look at areas that are not completely clear felled, but where people are removing important trees, important tall trees, you still get a big change in the climate inside the forest because you get a change in the structure. And that's what we are especially also looking at how changes in the forest structure, so the number of tall trees and the variation in the height in the trees, influences climate and temperatures for these animals inside the forest.
And there, of course, are many different endangered animals and species there because this is such a biodiverse environment. But one of those that's of particular concern is the Sumatran elephant. What's their status? What's happening to them?
Well, Sumatran elephants used to be quite widespread across Sumatra. At the moment, it looks like the Leuser ecosystem and some forest areas further north from it are the only last remaining places where there is a large enough population. But even there, a lot of the population seem to be isolated in small forest patches. So there's a good chance that they're not breeding together anymore. So they're not meeting other individuals anymore, and the genetic variation is going down. Now, the problem the elephants have is, of course, they're very much dependent on lowland forest that's not on high slopes. And that's the area that people are interested in as well. So that's where all the plantations are going. So the elephants are very much getting into conflict with people. And this is not something you would really hear about 24 years ago. But now you will often hear people poisoning elephants. They're setting up electric fences to stop them. And it's becoming a very big problem because as soon as you take the forest away, the elephants, of course, are going to come into the agricultural land. And they do like palm oil trees as well.
Well, what about the Sumatran tiger? I understand that even in the 1970s, there were more than 1,000 of them in Sumatra, in Indonesia. Now there's only about 300-400 of them left. What's their status?
Well, the one big problem we have with tigers and elephants and a lot of the other wildlife is that we actually don't know how many there are left. Tigers, of course, have the same problems when their habitat is disappearing. They're also struggling to find enough food and not to get into conflict with people. And I remember stories when I was there 24 years ago, that they would still have tigers coming into their plantation to eat the durian fruit, although you wouldn't expect tigers to eat fruit. And you wouldn't hear that now anymore. They're not as common anymore at all.
And
so yeah, this is not so good.
Well, tell us, if you would, about how local people view these issues. Obviously, they see in many cases that orangutans, elephants, tigers are pests, that they destroy their crops or are threats in some ways. How do they react to these efforts to sort of preserve the forest, to preserve the ecosystem?
In my experience, as long as you approach the problem appropriately and culturally sensitive enough, most people really appreciate the forest, and they understand that the elephants are coming into their plantations because they have been taking away the elephants' forest. So they do understand that. But at the same time, of course, they're struggling to maintain their rice paddies or their palm oil plantations. And so they are trying to chase them away. The elephants do destroy houses. And of course, that is a big problem. So we're working together with the local conservation units that are trying to use tame elephants to drive away the wild elephants when they come closer to the villages, to help the people and help them protect them. For the orangutans, when I used to be there, it was never a problem to have, nobody was aggressive towards an orangutan, but these days you can hear much more about that, where people are actually hurting the orangutans when they're left alone on the plantation, which is a big surprise for me to hear that, because a lot of people still very much care about the forest. And I think those are the people that we really want to reach, and we want to improve conservation in the areas.
Well, Amanda Korstjens, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
A reminder that you're tuned in to Global Journalist. We're talking today about deforestation in Indonesia, a country that is home to the third largest area of tropical forest in the world. Now, this has consequences not only for endangered species, but for climate change and the people in the region as well. To expand our discussion, we're going to bring in 3 other people who are following this issue closely. Joining us from San Francisco is Rolf Skar. He's the Forest Campaign Director for Greenpeace USA. And in Oslo, Norway is Anja Lillegraven. She's the head of the Southeast Asia and Oceania Division at the Rainforest Foundation Norway. And finally, in Burlington, Vermont, is Laurel Neme. She's an author and journalist who has written for National Geographic, the Huffington Post, and other news outlets. Welcome to all of you. Rolf Skar, let me start with you. You've been following this issue for quite some time. Give us just a little bit of background about what the Indonesian government's position has been, what their efforts have been to slow the rate of deforestation.
Thanks. Yeah. Recently, the Indonesian government and president have made the right signals in terms of wanting to address their out-of-control deforestation problem. But efforts to do so have been hampered by what I call the 3 C's: corruption, chaos. So, for example, they don't even have one map that shows who is in control of what land, and a general lack of capacity.
Okay. And so you mentioned corruption, chaos, lack of capacity. Has there been progress in recent years, or do we see that this problem is still accelerating?
There have been steps forward. So, for example, the Indonesian president in recent years has declared a moratorium, a ban on new plantation concession licenses, so in an attempt to sort of try to get a handle on land use, where palm oil should be grown, where it shouldn't be. But it's been incomplete. And every time there's a step forward, there's a reaction from the large moneyed interests that influence politics, both in Indonesia and around the world, and kind of want to keep things the way they have been.
Well, Laurel Neme, if I could turn to you then, tell us just a little bit about palm oil. Why is it in such demand? What is it used for? What makes it more desirable than other types of vegetable oils?
Well, palm oil is in thousands and thousands of household items, everything from like personal care products like shampoos, cosmetics, cleaning supplies like detergents, and a lot of processed foods, candy, cookies, that sort of thing. And probably about half of the items on our supermarket shelves contain some sort of palm oil. And it's used with good reason. It's really versatile, and it has a longer shelf life than other vegetable oils. And also, the yields are higher than for other types of oil seeds. So that means that not only can you harvest the fruits year-round, but about half of the fruit produces oil as compared to other types of oilseed crops, which is a lot less.
Well, let me turn this to you, Anja Lillegraven. Tell us just a little bit about some of the companies that have been involved in palm oil plantation production. I understand that your group has been involved particularly in a campaign involving a Hong Kong-based company called Jardine Matheson. It's a company that owns Mandarin Oriental Hotel, runs a number of Kentucky Fried Chicken and Pizza Hut franchises in Asia, but also has interests in palm oil plantations in Indonesia.
Yes, thank you. Actually, my organization, the Rainforest Foundation Norway, has done a number of efforts in order to reduce the expansion of palm oil plantations in Indonesia. One thing is that we have been taking demand measures in Norway. We had a campaign on palm oil informing consumers in Norway about the linkages between palm oil production and rainforest destruction, which resulted to a reduce of the use of palm oil in food products by 2/3 in 1 year in Norway. That has been noticed internationally, for instance, by Norway's Sovereign Wealth Fund, who is actually an investor in, of course, a number of companies all over the world, including palm oil companies. As a result of this campaign, the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Norway actually divested in a number of palm oil companies. I think we are now talking about 32 companies.
Okay. Let me turn this, if I might, to Rolf Skar then, because it sounds like around the world, especially in Europe and in North America, there have been efforts to boycott palm oil. What's Greenpeace's view on these types of actions?
Well, we're not calling for a boycott on palm oil for a couple of reasons. First, we think there's an important role for the palm oil industry in Indonesia. Second, we think that the global demand is hard to affect through consumer boycott campaigns. India and China are by far the largest users, where it's like cooking oil. So we actually think that it's more important that the big users of palm oil talk to the producers of palm oil and tell them to do better, to cultivate palm oil where there isn't rainforest right now, to make sure they're respecting human rights, make sure that there's no child labor involved in their operations, and to set a new normal for the industry so that people around the world don't have to make choices, read every label on the back of every product, but can go to the store and know that the products they're getting aren't linked to these terrible problems.
So in other words, not all palm oil is produced in deforested areas. Then it sounds like there's some palm oil that's produced perfectly legitimately without significant environmental concerns.
Yeah, so Jason,
well,
if I may add
that
on.
yet, but
Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
There's not
Anja.
enough of that yet, but we're hoping through demand that supply will be created.
And Anja, go ahead, join.
Yes, if I may add to that, I agree with Rolf. We are also not calling for a boycott, but we are trying to reduce the demand because it's the demand that is driving the expansion. And the level, I mean, the rate of expansion currently happening in Indonesia now, it's not possible to fulfill by sustainable production. But what we did as a result of this campaign, the awareness created, we did target specific countries asking for exactly what Rolf is mentioning, sustainable policies, or sustainability policies from these companies. And one of them is what Jason referred to previously, the palm oil company owned by Jardine Mathieson, which is called Astra Agrolestari. It's the second largest palm oil company in Indonesia. As a result of this campaign and the dialogue we had with them, they actually came out with a very progressive, ambitious sustainability policy. So in that end, it was a success, but we are still in dialogue with this company and pushing them to actually implement the policy. Because one thing is to produce a paper, but you also need to ensure that you are following up on the pledges you make.
And if I could turn this to Laurel Neme. Laurel, we just heard Anja and Rolf talking about how a number of companies have adopted policies not to source palm oil from plantations that are built on deforested areas. You wrote recently for National Geographic's website about this protected forest called the Loser ecosystem. I guess it's a lowland forest. It's about the size of Massachusetts and Sumatra. It has a herd of Sumatran elephants there. There's so much biodiversity. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. But tell us just briefly what is happening there.
So that's been, like you said, it's the last place on Earth where orangutans, tigers, rhinos, and elephants can live side by side. It's the only place in the world where that happens. And in 2008, the government declared it a national strategic area for its environmental services. So both for carbon storage in its peat swamps and also, you know, with the forest protecting from floods. And it's also a critical watershed area. But what you've had there is a lot of issues related to concessions, both in terms of the way land is designated, whether it's okay for use. And there's been a conflict between the provincial government and the national government regarding its land use plan. So that's one area on the political side. But at the same time, you've had violations of policy so that there's clearing when there shouldn't be, when there's been government moratoriums on clearing, both in terms of additional clearing in existing concessions and also new clearing and expansion. And I should say, it's really, you know, you had asked about the palm oil industry, and it's a very complex industry because you have there are a lot of places where a commitment can be monitored. One is, you know, at the plantation, which is actually being cleared, but then it goes to a mill, and then it goes to a refinery and a trader, and possibly like a chemical company if it's used in something like a cosmetic, because there's a lot of different forms of palm oil. And so even for the consumer who wants to boycott, it's actually very difficult because if you read the label, sometimes it's not labeled, or if it is labeled, it can take just dozens and dozens of forms, and you'd have to know all those forms to know what to boycott. And that's also the same for companies who want to implement their commitments. It's actually very difficult to trace your supply all the way back, depending on where in the supply you purchased it. And some of the big traders, especially Wilmar, who you might hear a lot about, has a zero deforestation commitment. And that applies across the whole supply chain. And they've really been starting to move the market. And they account for about half of all global trade.
Well, we'll remind you that you're listening to Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. We're talking today about deforestation in Indonesia, where a tropical forest area the size of Delaware has been disappearing each year. We're joined by Rolf Skar of Greenpeace USA, Anja Lillegraven of the Rainforest Foundation, and Laurel Neme, an author and journalist who's written for National Geographic and other outlets. If you're interested in more Global Journalist, you can visit our website, globaljournalist.org. There you'll find more coverage of underreported international news and human rights issues. You can also like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or subscribe to this program on YouTube or iTunes. Well, Rolf Skar, let me turn this to you now. Tell us, if you would, just a little bit about the picture for climate change in these forests. I understand that in 2015 there were these massive fires in Indonesia caused by deforestation that left this huge haze sort of all over Southeast Asia, stretching all the way to Singapore. What was the end result of that? Did that change the discussion some?
Yeah, just to paint a picture, these large wet rainforest areas and these peatlands are drained in order to be able to make them suitable for these plantations. But when you drain them and dry them out, they become very prone to fire. And then humans often set fires to clear the rainforest, and those fires get out of control, especially when it's a particularly dry season. So that's what happened in 2015. It burned for months. The smoke spread across seas and polluted Singapore, creating hazardous air in different countries. And it poisoned many hundreds of thousands of people. A recent Harvard study estimated that 100,000 people could have died prematurely because of the toxic haze from these forest fires. So it's a human health problem immediately, and it's a huge problem for climate change as well, because the rates of climate pollution that are coming out of those kinds of fires are simply unsustainable. It was enough to emit more pollution than the whole United States and to make Indonesia quickly one of the world's largest climate polluters in 2015.
And how is this addressed through international sort of climate agreements, the Paris Agreement? I mean, I can see if you're from Indonesia and you're at the table with Europe and the United States, many European countries, the United States, clear-cut most of their old-growth forests hundreds of years ago. So if you're Indonesia, I can see why you might say, well, you had a resource that you took advantage of. Now we'd like to take advantage of our forests.
That's true, but no one can argue that these fires and this sort of climate change are going to help Indonesians either. You know, they're dying now from toxic haze, and Indonesia is one of the countries most at risk of the effects of climate change. So Indonesia has a lot to lose if it doesn't address this problem. I should say this is a global problem. You know, it's not just Indonesia's fault. These products and the demand for palm oil, as others have already mentioned, is global. So I think Americans, Europeans, people around the world bear responsibility and deserve to accept some responsibility for it. I think we should help Indonesia with capacity, with money, and with incentives to deliver better results on the ground.
And Anja Lillegraven, if I could turn it to you then, how has the international community, how are they trying to incentivize Indonesians, especially the local people that live near these forests, to preserve them then? Because if it's not in their economic interest, it seems like it would be a losing battle over time.
It definitely is. Only a short time ago, the finance minister of Indonesia actually stated publicly that the palm oil sector in Indonesia was most likely not benefiting the country economically. That is due to the consequences of deforestation. The international community has moved forward on the...
Well, I'm sorry, Anja, if I could stop you there. How is it, this is Indonesia's largest export, how is it that it can't be benefiting the country economically in total?
If you look at the costs of the fires in 2015, that was enormous. And compared to the income that palm oil generates, it equals out the income. Another thing which is important to keep in mind is that the income from all these sectors driving deforestation, such as palm oil, mining, pulp and paper, is not benefiting the people as a whole. Most of those money made is going to a small elite of politicians with vested interests because they have ownership in these companies. The people on the ground people depending on the forest, living in the forest, using the forest for their daily livelihoods, they are the losers. They do not earn any money on these expensive industries.
Well, Laurel Neme, if I could turn it to you, you were speaking before about how difficult it is to ensure that the products that you're using are either don't contain palm oil or contain palm oil that is only sourced from sustainable sources, if you will. What can consumers do? What can ordinary people do if they want to make an impact on this issue?
Well, I think what's interesting is that simply listening to a program like this and learning about it is actually key. Because one of the things that's happening globally, we've been talking about the commitments, and the commitments that companies are making for a more sustainable supply include not just no deforestation, but no peat, which is where a lot of the fires come from, and then also no exploitation of the workers.
Sorry, you mentioned peat. This is like the top level of soil that's in these rainforests then.
Yeah, it's a carbon-rich soil that some of them are mineral soils and some of them are carbon-rich peat soils. So like in the Loser ecosystem, there's peat swamps, and that's one of the areas that's been targeted and cleared out and causing a lot of the haze and the fires that you've been hearing about. And that's also an area that has like the densest population, the world's densest population of Sumatran orangutans, which are critically endangered. But in terms of these government commitments, they're starting to highlight this, and Indonesia is starting to really become, and I'm not saying it's there by any stretch, but is starting to look at these issues in a way that is where the companies can start enforcing it. And so companies like Wilmar, Ferrero, Nestle are getting together with the Forest Trust and actually Airbus Defense and SAR-Vision, and they're creating this high resolution, basically it's satellite and radar imaging to track the changes on what's happening with the forest cover so that they can immediately identify where clearing is taking place. So this is all really outside, in a lot of ways, outside of the government, but then there's pressure on the government. So things are changing both internally and from the outside. The more consumers know and ask for these types of policies, the more you're actually implementing change. And Indonesia has a vested interest in becoming that, because as you see oil palm plantations starting in other countries in Africa, Indonesia can have more intensive and better managed oil palm and so plantations, and so that can be where one puts their money.
And that's going to have to do it for this edition of Global Journalist, a production of the Missouri School of Journalism and KBIA Mid-Missouri Public Radio. Our thanks to Amanda Korstjens, Rolf Skar, Anja Lillegraven, and Laurel Neme for joining us. Our assistant producers this week are Wei-Meng Bao, Fallon Page, Sophia Sader, and Hannah Sandfeld, with supervising producer Jinhong Chen. Alyssa Blyle is our visual editor, and Pat Akers is our audio engineer. Our director is Travis McMillan. For all of us at Global Journalist, I'm Jason McClure. Thanks for tuning in.